Then I'm going to talk about tidal locking, which is something I didn't talk about before, explain why the moon has got the same face facing towards Earth, and also a lot of other moons in the solar system too. Have a little brief inventory of the solar system. We all know about the 8 or 8.5 planets, as whatever Pluto is, but there's also a lot of interesting moons in the solar system, and we'll go through those really briefly. And then we're going to talk a little bit about orbital resonance, which is closely related to the tidal locking, but it sort of also affects how the rotational orbits center resonate, and that's an interesting thing as well. And then we're going to talk about all the places in the solar system where tides played a very significant part in the evolution of things. So we showed this last time. We explained, how the you've got the moon here, and here's the rotating Earth. And we explained why the tides are actually offset from the plane of the moon, which is something you rarely see on the internet. But they are offset simply because the world is rotating and it's pushing the tides around, and the moon's gravity is trying to basically hold it back. So that tidal wave stays in place, and then the world rotates beneath that wave. And not just the tides, not just the ocean, but the crust and the mantle, everything in there is also subject to those same forces as well. And then last time we sort of explained why the moon moves away, because if you got a tidal force up from this center line here, the net effect is it's going to push the moon, give it a little kick, and it's over millions of years it's going to put the moon into a higher orbit. And then we also showed the reverse case. Supposing the Earth was rotating clockwise, but the moon is still going anti-clockwise. We then showed that the same effect will happen on the bulge here. It will tend to slow the Earth down. And at the same time, because the kick is now this way from the line, opposite to the moon's direction, it's going to tend to slow the moon down, which will bring the moon closer to Earth. And there is one moon in the solar system where that is actually happening now, which we'll talk about later. Then we talked a little bit about how easy it is to understand the moon's gravitational pull, sucking the tides towards the moon. But it's a little harder to explain the bulge on the back of the planet. And I wasn't completely happy with what I read online about the centrifugal force being everything. But be that as it may, and I'm not going to use my prop today, it's deflating pretty rapidly, but I wanted to show you, like, oops, get back here. Okay, let's get back to this one here. Okay, this very center line here is the axis of rotation for the Earth is going around that center, and the moon is going around that center as well. We try to explain that because that is like the balance point, the center of gravity of the Earth-Moon system is just inside the Earth there. So if you can imagine the Earth turning around that axis, the outer part of the Earth is going to be subject to that centrifugal force pushing the tide out. But the fact that it takes 29 days to do an orbit, I found it difficult to believe that it would cause such an effect, which is why I talked about, which is why I talked about the Roche limit, which is according to what the body is made of, that might be approaching the Sun or the Earth. Once it crosses this limit here, that will be enough for the tidal forces to literally tear that body apart. And what happens, as you can see when we're at the limit, and I explained the reason for that is because anything orbiting the Sun here, inside of the center of gravity, wants to go faster, and anything on the outside really wants to go slower. But because the moon is like, or asteroid is stuck together, the whole thing is forced to move at the same natural orbital speed as the center of gravity. But when the moon breaks apart, as you can see there, the stuff on the inside will want to go faster, and the stuff on the outside will want to go slower. And the eventual result of that is we'll get a ring formation, just like Saturn. So we just discussed that last time, and now I want to talk a little bit about tidal locking. Now imagine here this oval-shaped body here, really exaggerated, is the moon as it was, say, millions or billions of years ago when it was molten, which means that it'd be very easy to deform the shape of the moon because of the tidal effect. And because the moon was rotating this way, we believe, just like most other moons, they all go around the same direction anti-clockwise if you're looking down onto the solar system. So the moon would then be subject to the same tidal forces, and because this bulge out here, if you look at that previous picture, there's going to be a torque trying to twist that body back so that eventually these pointy parts here of the ellipse, if you like, will now line up along the line like that. This is exactly how the moon is today. And it's simply a matter of understanding, you know, once you get that tidal bulge at an angle like that from the plane of the moon and the Earth, then it's easy to visualize what forces are acting upon it and why there's going to be that torque trying to bring the moon, you know, to face the Earth there. So that's what tidal locking is all about. Now, I just wanted to show you this quick animation because I found it kind of interesting. We talked about the barycenter of the Earth-Moon system, but this animation will show you the barycenter of the Sun, if you like, and what happens to its barycenter based on two major planets, Jupiter and Saturn. Okay, the center of the picture there is the I'm not sure.
Don't worry about it.
Maybe if I do this to full screen, it'll work. No, I guess it's not going to show it. Well, we'll forget that one, unfortunately. What it is showing you that the Sun, because it's influenced by all of the planets, mostly Jupiter and Saturn, it does an incredible loop-de-loop around the barycenter. It's really, really complicated. It just shows you, if you've got all those planets acting on the Sun, and it's got a wobbly motion like that, it can certainly affect, you know, the outer layers of the Sun, make them bulge in all directions. The people are theorizing out there that that might be part of the cause of the sunspot cycles being caused by the planets. Anyway, we'll go to the next slide. Wait, I couldn't show that. I didn't show the animation, but what the animation actually shows is here's the Sun in 1940, and it does this incredible loop-de-loop, thousands of loops, and then back to 2000. Sometimes the Sun is outside the barycenter, and sometimes it's right in a little bit. It's an interesting animation. It's too bad we didn't get it to rotate. Okay, here's our main planets in the solar system, and just to recap the incredible difference in size between Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars versus Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And although it's interesting that the the gravitational force on the edge of Jupiter is only about 2G, and on Saturn it's only about 1G. So you're far from the center there compared to how close we are to the center of Earth. But even so, there are massive bodies, those big gas giants, and tidal forces that the moons will be subject to are way, way higher than what our moon is subject to. And here's an idea of, the moon is in the solar system here. try to put Jupiter and Saturn in there, we've got a screen as big as this room. But it does show Venus and Earth, and Mars, and Mercury. It's got a major moons here of there's the Jupiter moons, here's the Saturn moons, Uranus, and here's Neptune here. The biggest moon in the solar system is Ganymede from Jupiter. Then there's Titan from Saturn, then Callisto, and then the fourth one is Io, which we talked about as well, that's subject to the gravity side forces. Then we have our moon, it's the fifth largest, then Europa, then Triton, Titan rather, no, we've had Titan. After Europa it's Triton, so that's the seventh. And then the eighth one is actually Titanium from Uranus, but it's only just over half the diameter of Triton, which means it's only about a fifth of the mass, so I don't consider that a major moon. But major moons are very interesting. Again, this one just shows you how they're organized by planet era, with the Earth there size. And you can see Neptune is interesting. It's only got it's only got one major moon, and it's got a couple of other really small ones there. You know, Uranus has got a nice suite of medium-sized moons. Saturn's only got the one large moon. Jupiter's got 4 large moons, and then of course there's Earth, which has got a large moon as well. So let's have a look at Mercury here. Highly elliptical orbit, the eccentricity is 0.2, which means it's a lot more eccentric in orbit than what our moon is, and also the Earth around the Sun. And as a result of that, the tidal forces will be constantly changing depending on how close it is to the Sun. Now, the orbital period around the Sun is 88 Earth days. The rotational period of the planet with respect to the stars, the sidereal rotation rate, is only 59 Earth days. And yet the length of the day is 176 days. And you might wonder, how on earth could that possibly happen? Well, another interesting fact is the rotational ratio is, so the orbital period is 3 to 2. In other words, for every 3 times that the planet rotates, it goes around the Sun twice. So it has to go around the Sun twice to come back to exactly the same position that it started with. And this one helps explain it a little better. Like if we start off here, where you're facing the night side, as it starts to orbit the Sun, it'll rotate anti-clockwise slightly, and then when it's down a third of the way around, it'll rotate in half a rotation there. When it comes over to this point, it's rotated another half, so it's now facing in the same direction it started with. But by the time it gets back on the first orbit, it's now facing the Sun. And as it comes down into 5 and 6, and then back to 1 again there. Now the interesting part, because this is probably exaggerated about, the fact that it has this elliptical orbit means that as Mercury whips around by the perihelion here, it's actually moving faster than what it's rotating with respect to the Sun. So if you're coming around this part of the planet, you'll see the Sun very slowly coming up in the sky, and then as you come into this part of the orbit, you will see the Sun actually retrogress and go backwards across the sky before it picks up again and goes forward again. Of course, that whole cycle of the Sun, like I said, takes about 176 days there. So it's an interesting one because elliptical orbits tend to form an orbital resonance, not necessarily one-to-one. Like the Moon is in a one-to-one resonance with Earth because it takes one turn of the Moon, which equals one orbit of the Moon too. But planets with elliptical orbits, or moons with elliptical orbits, tend to form resonance on a slightly different, this one is like 3 to 2. A little hard to understand why, and I'm certainly not going to get into the maths of that one. Anyway, here's Venus without its atmosphere, and there's not too much to say about that because it doesn't have any moons, but it does have a strange, what we call a near-orbital resonance with Earth. Could be coincidental, But for every 13 times Venus goes around the Sun, Earth goes around 8 times. And the difference between those two is 5, which means you'll get an inferior conjunction with Venus. Every 5th conjunction, Venus and Earth will be pretty much at the same place in space again. So that's an interesting relationship there. Now, whether it's a real one or whether it's trying to form this resonance, we don't really know yet. So it's an interesting mystery anyway. Onto Mars, it's only got 2 tiny, tiny moons. Phobos is so close that it actually rises in the west and sets in the east because it's going around faster than the planet is orbiting. But no significant tidal effects that we know of there. Now, if we look at this chart here, it's a logarithmic graph which shows the. I'll get used to this, yeah. Okay, so logarithmic scale. So here's Earth, 1 year there. Mars is about 1.7. But this is the semi-major axis of the ellipse. Obviously, the further the planet is away, the greater the axis of the elliptical path. But the interesting part here as well is that if you look at the 4 moons of Jupiter, they also follow that same straight line. But you'll notice that Io only takes 2 days to orbit Jupiter. So you can just imagine the tremendous tidal effects that you get on the planet when it's orbiting so close like that. And Europa too, which is about, I know it's logarithmic, but Europa takes about 3.5 Earth days to go around Jupiter. So those 2 planets are subject to enormous tidal forces. And in fact, all 4 of those Galilean moons are in fact tidal up. They're all facing Jupiter, but because the orbits are slightly elliptical, they do tend to change, so the forces do change as the moons go around Jupiter. And there's just a picture of what they look like. There we have Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto. And the interiors of them are a little interesting. They all have that core. But if you look at Io, you notice it's got a molten silicated interior there, which means that the whole moon is basically a molten body, which is the very, very thin crust on the outside. Europa is believed to have this liquid ocean under the surface. And it's possible Ganymede might have liquid water as well under the planet. We're not really completely sure of that, but it talks about an icy mantle. And Callisto, which is even further out, has got it doesn't seem like it's settled down into any kind of thing yet, but there it is. Now, the interesting thing about these, if you look at this, you've got a very fascinating orbital resonance there. Every time that Io rotates, Io is the inner moon, and we have Europa and then Ganymede. Callisto doesn't form a resonance with them. But for every two rotations of Io, Europa does 1, and for every rotation of Ganymede, Io does 4, and that pattern is locked in indefinitely. And because it's locked in like that, the planets, the moons by themselves can't move the way they really like to around Jupiter, so they're subject to a lot of tidal forces, both from the moons and from the planet itself. Because, like I said, massive Jupiter, with Io only taking 2 days to go around it, they discovered with the Voyager probe down there that the whole moon is just full of volcanoes. And here's one caught in the act up there. There's a real photograph of the moon, eh? So it looks like something out of a science fiction planet, doesn't it? It's really amazing. There's what it may look like from the surface, possibly. Lots of sulfur, of course, that gives it the other color. Now, Europa, that's the one that we believe has a liquid ocean beneath the surface. And it's got a fascinating surface. So there's obviously a lot of tidal stresses have been acting on the surface there, causing what we believe are cracks in the ice and then water refreezing on the outside again. And there's a close-up of the surface. Look how complicated it is. It's just amazing. And here's one. This was actually taken from Hubble. Not that last September, I believe. And there's evidence now that there may be jets of water shooting off certain places around Europa, which again lends more credence to the fact that it's got this liquid interior caused by tidal stresses squeezing everything and making everything hotter inside there. Couldn't resist by showing a nice picture of Saturn, of course. And the sun is down here somewhere looking up a little bit. You can see by the shadow here. And these are the shadows of the rings right on the planet there. Now, as we mentioned, one of the most likely causes of those rings is the breakup of an asteroid or moonlet or something that came too close, got past the Roche limit and ripped the moon apart, and then settled down into a ring. Now, as far as the moons are concerned, the major moons here, like Midas isn't really that big, but this red circle here is Enceladus, and that one is a very interesting moon. Again, all of these moons here, even beyond that, here's Rhea out here, and Titan is way beyond this as well. But every one of those moons is tiny locked. In other words, they keep one face toward Saturn at all times. And there's a comparison with the sizes of them there. Like I said, look at the size of Titan, compared to these nearer ones here. But Enceladus is the second major moon past the planet, Venus being the first one. If you look at the rings up there, they named the rings as they were discovered. You've got the A on the outside, A, B, C, and D. And then they discovered this very diffuse E ring here, which is just outside the orbit of Venus there, going all the way up to Titus. It's almost like a huge ice crystal haze that is the E ring there. And then later they discovered the F ring here, and then the G ring. I'm not sure if this H ring has been discovered yet. But they're wondering, well, what on earth could cause that diffuse ring like that? And the culprit is actually Enceladus here, the moon. And interesting there about orbital resonances, Tethys and Mimas have that 2 to 4 resonance, similar to the Jupiter resonance. There's Dion and Enceladus have a 1 to 2, and then 3 to 4 with Hyper and Titan. Now the reason this one is 2 to 4 and not 1 to 2 is because the way the moon librates a bit, and the way you see it, it takes the double orbit to get exactly to the start from here. And these are near orbital resonances. They could be on their way to becoming resonant, or they could be breaking up from a previous resonance, or they could be just coincidence. But they were mentioned in the literature, just trying to sort of pass that on. So anyway, Enceladus, that's what it looks like on the south pole. And these huge cracks along here, they've observed they seem to be sort of shooting out jets of water vapor from the interior of the planet there. So it's very geologically active. Now, if we look at this picture, which has got this area here, which is cratered, so that's not very geologically active there. But this southern part here, where all the jets are shooting out, is very smooth, which means it's a very new surface. There's been no meteorites crashing onto it there. And they believe that one, well, they've actually seen it. It definitely has a subsurface ocean. And if you look at this picture, this was taken from Cassini, and obviously it's false color, but it's showing that there is very, very clear jet coming out there. And it wasn't just water vapor they discovered. They also discovered ice, and also a lot more organics than what they ever expected to find, which has kind of given people to think, well, gee, maybe there might be life there if there's a lot of organics. And this one is right on NASA's hit list for doing a visit to, as well as Europa, because that's probably the best chance we got out of Mars that we may find life. Only this time it might even be still there. Uranus, interesting situation. Doesn't have any major moons, it's only got those small, medium ones. So I wonder if one of the reasons that it might be tilted 98 degrees to the ecliptic I say 98 instead of 82 simply because the North Pole, rotating the same way as the other planets, is down here and not up here. But because it doesn't really have any what I would call large moons, there's nothing that I can find that there's any real tidal effects of interest that I could find in the literature anyway. But moving on to Neptune, we have the big moon Triton there, and right away you can see from the surface, you've got this this whole surface here is believed to be full of light which was expelled from the interior at some time. And it must have covered the planets at other times because there's no craters on this part of the moon either. So again, that one is was geologically active at some time and might even still be. And the belief is that, oh yeah, in fact they have actually observed jets of nitrogen gas skirting out of some of the regions there, the probes, Voyager went by. And along with the nitrogen, there was probably this ice as well. But, so again, it seems that as tidal influences on these planets, these moons have heated them up so much that you can get liquid water that far away from the sun. So I thought that was rather interesting. Oh, one interesting thing about Triton too, it's the only major moon in the solar system that has a retrograde orbit. So you remember we showed those pictures earlier, we said if the moon is going the opposite way to the rotation of the planet, the tidal forces will tend to bring that moon closer. Well, right now Triton is almost perfectly circular orbit, but they believe it was elliptical at one time, and it was probably captured something, a Kuiper belt object, because it's basically the same composition as Pluto. So it's a rogue moon, if you like, that was captured elsewhere. And because it's going the opposite direction around the planet to what Neptune is rotating, it's actually getting closer to Neptune. So one of these days, and they think about 3.5 billion years from now, it'll pass that Roche limit, break up into pieces, and then have a massive ring system, something like Saturn. Uranus does have moon. Neptune does have rings now, but they're very expensive. But it will be a major moon system once major ring system once that moon cracks up. Now, almost at the end, we've got Charon and Pluto. This is the only moon-planet system in the solar system where both of them are tightly up to each other and facing each other at all times. So that I thought was a little bit interesting. And again, there's an interesting resonance between Pluto and Neptune. Every 2 times that Pluto orbits the Sun, Neptune orbits 3 times, and the perihelion of both of those orbits stay in step. So where Pluto crosses Neptune's orbit, there's any danger of the line. And actually, there's other kind of objects also have various resonant frequencies with Neptune as well. So whether it's coincidence or whether it's all just these tidal effects, I don't know. It's interesting situation. So that's basically what I have for you, and I thought it was interesting. I tried to make it as visually pleasing as I could. So hopefully we've got time for a question or two, if anyone's not clear on anything. I know.
week one. I'm not supposed to be up here. I got diselected last month with our new president. Some excuse like flying in from Cuba. Hawaii. Same difference. I know. Cuba's a little friendlier. But anyway, it's all politics. So I've allowed him to beg off on conducting the meeting. And so tonight, we have already heard from Mick about the beginner session. And I'll cover up some announcements that we have, and then we'll have Brian tell us what's coming up. Are you looking from tonight forward or tomorrow forward?
That's nice.
So I don't have to ask who saw the lunar eclipse tonight. All right, I'll let you ask that question. And we have Ian, who is going to keep us up on what's been happening in the last few weeks or month of research in astronomy. Who's new here tonight? Anybody? Oh, we have one. Oh, welcome to the meeting. Cover off a few things you might find interesting on tonight. After we have our break, and we have some books to give away. Some from my library and some that Ian has brought along. Chris, do we have tickets? We do. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll get one ticket for each book and put them down in front of them, just like that, and one will draw for them. Then when our break is done, I'll be talking a little bit about a little area of interest of mine, which is actually in the astronomy of Sumeria and Babylon. Of course, no you won't. Anyway, the National Star Party has officially been announced for July the 29th, partly in celebration of Canada's 150th anniversary. One of the things we want to do with this is to invite non-RASC astronomy clubs, which for us would be Brandon, at least, to participate in some kind of a star party. Now, we haven't worked out any detail of the public star party. It won't be one of our occasional club members only star parties. So we will be working on that as we get into late July. Our national executive officer apologized for making it on July 29 when the people in the Yukon pointed out that all they were going to look at was the sun. So you may want to do that a little later or a little earlier later on. We also sent a note saying that they have purchased 25,000 solar filters. Of course, this is in preparation for the total solar eclipse, partial solar eclipse here in Winnipeg on August 21, where the sun will be more than three-quarters covered by the moon here. We will set up our own star party for that, like we in the Cinnamon Park. People. I'm not sure that 25,000 might not be enough for us, and we're expected to share those with the rest of Canada. But the last time, I think we had 500, and we were parsimonious about giving them out so that we had a few hundred left over for a future event. But they look like this. They're not glasses. They're actually little panels that you hold up and look through, and they're actually more convenient and much more durable than eclipse glasses because they don't get broken and worn out as you take them on and off with various ears. So these are easy to pass around from one person to another to watch the eclipse with partial phases. For those that I'm hoping somebody will not be traveling in the U.S. to see the solar eclipse and then take the time to be able to handle the partial eclipse. Otherwise, we have to leave it so we're really on the present. Yeah, we in Nebraska. I never really thought I'd ever say that, but except that we We need a secretary to sit on council. We didn't elect one last time because nobody volunteered to do it or was nominated to do it. I would like to hear from somebody to take on that job. Or actual Brendan would like to hear from somebody to take on this job. Keep it in mind that we'll be asking them on somebody. We're required that you attend about 4 meetings a year and a few other details, one of which is to fill out a report that goes to national every year. That report takes your solo writer 10 minutes. Fast, it's 5 minutes because it comes pre-canned and you just fill in the numbers. I've brought along 100 copies of Sky News. This is the current edition that came to most of you in the mail last week or a week and a half ago. This is a promotion by National, and these are to be given out to schools, teachers, star parties, friends, whatever have you. We have about somewhere around 60, I would guess, spoken for. Wants to go out to the Oakhammock Marsh Star Party, so we'll give them quite a few there. And some going to Fort White Star Dinner. One of us. If you have a school that you think might want his office or friends or anybody that isn't in the RASC, because you already get it if you're in the RASC, help yourself to them. After I can move a certain number for other people. Messier Marathon next month. Nobody said very much about that. For those of you who are new, Charles Messier was one of the first people to make a catalog of things to see in the sky, 110 of them. And it's considered a sort of beginner's achievement to see all 110 of them. Probably around half of them can be seen with binoculars, 15 of them probably by eye. But nevertheless, it's a bit of a challenge to see 110, and we give out pins and certificates for people who do that. And it is possible in March to see, I would say 108, maybe 109 of the 110 in one night, providing it's absolutely crystal clear from start to finish. So we have this thing called the Messier Marathon, where we all get together and do collectively, individually in a collective, to see how many that you can see in one night. And then if you miss one or two, we'll pick them up different time of year. Usually the ones you miss are the ones that are too close to the sun, and too much in the bright sky, either in the morning or the evening. And we have books to give away, which I've already mentioned. So we'll look after the distribution of the tickets for that at the break. I'm pleased to announce that Jerry Smerchansky received the National Service Award. Congratulations, Jerry.
Thank you.
Sky tours and that he conducts at every one of the star parties, the schools he visits, the people he convinces, and he even looks like a guru. It all comes together in national recognition with the service award. My understanding is it doesn't come with money. Next month, the university is bringing in Dr. William McKinnon, who will be our speaker at next month's meeting, similarly to the one speaker we had last October. We are presumably contributing to the cost of bringing him in, although I haven't heard back from National on that. But he is one of the principal researchers for the New Horizons mission to Pluto, and so he'll be giving talks both at the university and seminars and to us and other members of the public at the next meeting in this room. So I think that'll be a little bit of a treat for us. He'll be able to explain the tidal walking of Pluto and carry lastly, just a repeat that the General Assembly in Ottawa is soliciting tax. The General Assembly is the annual meeting of people from the RASC all across the country. Usually has a number of quite interesting speakers and conduct business at that time. And a few of us will be attending, but I don't notice an overwhelming rush for a while to attend the Canada Day celebrations, because this is on the July 1 long weekend. The next open house at the university, on University College at the Planetarium, February 22, the last Wednesday of the month. I guess that's still ongoing, and it's totally not happening, so. That's a little interesting, because often February is still pretty cold, so you can go in and do some indoor astronomy in the planetarium. For new members, telescopes can be loaned out. Stand here tonight.
Yeah. I have one available right now.
There's one available, okay. What is it, an 8-inch?
8-inch dot.
So if you're a member and you want to take home a telescope for a month or so, and talk to Stan, sign his papers, and it will be yours to look at everything but the sun. And you can see what the details are in that. And Quintessentics, our newsletter, Mike has put in some work in Quintessentics lately. When he agreed to be editor, he asked me if he could cut it back to one issue every 2 months instead of every month. And he promptly goes and fills it up with 5 or 6 pages. He doesn't have enough space. If he doesn't do it every month. Is that right, Mike?
Working out pretty good so far.
How many people did you have to browbeat to get them to contribute?
Yeah, that's just much better. I think that might be pretty good.
First issue is always easy. When you get to the 10th one, where's Megan? She'll tell you all about that. And we have an email discussion list, which you can subscribe to. The details are here, rather than go through this at all. It's there for you to use. And if you want to be on the discussion list and find out who's going out to see the lunar eclipse, that I know some people saw it tonight, or to see the comet go by, which is tomorrow morning, I think. Probably also in cloud. The only distinction with the comet is that it's probably too faint to be seen by anyone other than the telescope. So there is where we are.
Just one comment about this, Jay. Make sure that you sign up. If you're using more than one email account, they all require a sign up from that account. Did that make
We'll
sense?
lead you through the process. It's somewhat fuzzy at this point, but
Well, if you signed up using one email account, you then try to write to the list using a different email account, I have to do something about it. I would rather not.
this email account has some manual intervention in it, and so we have to find the person with the manual capability to amend anything. So when you start changing email addresses and things like that, you will drop off. And every now and then I go through the whole list and take off all the people who were once members and are no longer. And I think it's maybe time to do that again. I haven't done it for about 8 years. Clean it up. In the email list, we probably have 400 members. In reality, we have about 210. Okay. So, what was my, who did I put first? Ryan. Any questions while I'm at it?
You do this every month?
Yeah. Hey, Jay.
Yes.
Jay, I'm going to sign an executive order to get you to do whatever you want.
No more executive
Going to the
orders.
Chris. No more wall.
That's a big problem, because they probably would do it.
Speak up, Brian, I can't hear you. All right, this is what we have for what's up in February. Okay, cool planets. Not much happening really, but Venus is going to be pretty bright on February the 17th. Watch out for it. Jupiter is going to be in its retro motion for the next few months, I believe. And of course, Saturn is going to be moving from Ophiuchus, I believe the constellation is called. It's a morning kind of planet. All right, this is I guess a top view of it. Some of you can't see what the planets are, but I'll point it out. Okay. This is Earth, of course. This is Venus. We have Mercury. Mars is up here. Of course, you can see Jupiter and Saturn. This is what's happening tonight, right now. All right, that's okay, so this is during the day, just to give you an idea of what the planets are like during the day. Again, we saw what it's like in space. So we have Mercury here, and I believe we have Venus and Mars up here. This is what, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Next, in the evening, what do we have for the evening? Okay, we have, well, we do have a comet here, 2P, they're here, and then we have, I really can't see this well, but you've got Mars, Venus, for starters. That's the early evening. Oh, but I want to come back here because the point is, this is what early evening, you can see, I like Orion. Orion's my favorite constellation here, so you can see it's pretty early in the evening and it's almost pretty high, so kind of bear that in mind. All right, what do we have? Again, this is what, it's around 8 p.m. Mars is still up, we have here. We do have another comet here, I kind of mentioned back in December, 41P, but in your apps, when you do look for it, it's called TGK, I believe, so it doesn't spell its full name, it's just abbreviation for it. The magnitude is pretty low, so it's not really that great. Next, we have around 6:30 a.m. I'm going to point out that Jupiter is going to be kind of high in the morning, and Saturn is right about here. Now we have 45P Honda. The comets, to give you an idea, it's right next to Hercules. Be aware that it's going to be moving pretty fast. Another comet to watch out for, and I talked to Kevin about this one here. So we have Johnson here. That's another good comet you guys should be watching early in the morning. And I'll tell you why later. Okay, now for the celestial calendar. Of course, we have the annual lunar eclipse that's happening tomorrow or tonight. Right now? Okay, yeah. So what? It's going to, the moon's going to be a little darker than usual. That's what's going to happen. Next, on February the 13th, next for the 2 weeks, we have the zodiacal lights, which is pretty nice. And it makes it pretty easy because now it's in the evening, just after sunset. Makes it really easy to view it. Of course, as I mentioned before, Venus should be pretty bright on February the 17th. And of course, we have the moon on the 26th. Now, of course, some of the new members, I put this up here just to kind of give you an idea of what the zodiacal light is. From my earlier readings, it was supposed to be the leftover dust from the creation of the solar eclipse or the solar system. But one point I don't make about is that it's still being fueled by the previous comet that comes by, asteroids get collided, all the debris from that keeps it fueled up. So we will see. Now, apparently it's, and another point I want to make is, of course, it happens in the spring and the fall. In the spring, which is pretty much now, it's going to be evening. In the fall, it's going to be in the morning. And of course, the geometry has to be right when the sun hits it for us to see it. Now, just a little bit about how to see it. I've seen it personally myself, thanks to Jay, who we met in Arizona on our trip there. It's pretty big. It's bigger than what you really think. It was really nice to see it, thanks to Jay stopping along the way there. Of course, you got to be, can't have the full moon out there. You know, kind of hindered the viewing part of it. But if you haven't seen it, don't worry about it, because apparently some of the more experienced astronomers, professional astronomers, haven't seen it yet. All right, this is again kind of a side view of the solar system, and this is the dust. As you can see here, that's supposed to be Jupiter, that's supposed to be like, oh, that's Jupiter, that's Saturn, so you can see how big it is. Again, the geography has to be right for us to see it. Now here's a picture of it, to give you an idea of what it looks like, but it varies to degree. Again, when we're out there in Arizona, it was pretty nice, it was pretty big, away from the light pollution. Now this is kind of like I just put here, this little red light here, kind of give you an idea of the path of the sun, kind of give you an idea of how to look for it. Next, comet chasing. All right, we have the 45P Honda. I asked Kevin about this. He's in Arizona right now. We'll catch up with him in about a week's time. He said there's no tail to it, just the core of it. And it's pretty dim, he says, so it's not very good looking. Next one he does mention about Johnson, the one right there. He said it does have a tail, and it's not bad to look at, but what makes 45P Honda kind of nice is the magnitude is supposed to be 7, but he says it's pretty dim. We have the other one, the 2P, and then it's a magnitude of 9.7. Now this one here, I kind of mentioned about this back in December. Now this last line I want to mention about here, it's just like when you do look for it, it's called TGK, and that's what it's called. It doesn't spell out the full name. It's just, they call it TGK. Okay. Now, where to find it? Okay, here's a little bit better diagram of 45P Honda. It's right about here, so it's, what, 2 o'clock in the morning. And then we have the Johnson Comet here, too. So it's supposed to be right next to, I said Hercules, right? I can't see it. I really can't. All right. This is really, yeah, there's the Hercules constellation right there. Again, I gotta fix that. I had to brighten this up a little bit more, but I did. All right, this is Comet Johnson. Kind of give you an idea of the orbit it has. Kind of a weird orbit, you ask me. There's Earth right here, but it's still a well view. Now, what really gets me is that 45P Honda, it's pretty close, actually. There's Earth, and there's the comet 45P Honda. It's pretty close. And it should be relatively bright, but it's apparently not, according to Kevin Black in Arizona. So, that should be it. That's what I have. 45P, I guess I think it's 45P is going to dip a little bit. Right, so it's going to fade rapidly for 45P and even faster. Yeah. So comet is going to what did I say here? Honda's at 7. Yeah. 7 is touching on the ocular vision. It would be really look better than a small bore telescope, but it's no tail. You got to look at it. All right, well, we'll check it out ourselves.
We're a little short on comments these days. Ian, we're ready to fill us in on amazing new discoveries.
Amazing new discoveries.
Well, he's got a new reason for the
Oh, we're going to be starting?
get the adapter.
I did get an adapter, but I wasn't quite sure what we were going to find, so I was at HGM. We can try. It doesn't work.
Brian, are both those comets past perihelion now?
Sorry?
The Johnson and the Honda comets, are they both past perihelion?
I'm just close. One go past this way.
Honda would have just. What about the Johnson? Is it still inbound or is it heading out?
He's heading out.
I don't know.
All right, sure.
They're both heading out now?
right, let's go.
Thank you for that.
Astronomy, because I think that it offers us a lot of perspective on how we got to where we are, right? How our thought process evolved, and historically, Jake has always been the way things thought. So I am very much looking forward to this. So, Jake.
Thank you, Brenda.
I don't know when I first got into Babylonian astronomy. It had something to do with eclipses. And when you get into it, it's kind of a very, very interesting astronomy. Partly because they were exceptionally good at it, especially after the first 1,500 years had passed. And secondly, they never really cared why. All they wanted to know was why. And so, in some respects, they established at least Western astronomy and quite possibly astronomy across most of the globe, because they solved a lot of the problem of when do things happen? Where do they happen? But not why do they happen? Why does it happen was left to the Greeks to discover. So the Babylonians had really quite an amazing mathematics. They had, I guess for this day and age, would probably not be a very efficient writing system, but because it was done on clay tablets that got baked, especially when the buildings were set on fire, that it was extremely durable. So all the papyrus and a lot of the other flimsier media have disappeared. The cuneiform or cuneiform, however you want to pronounce it, tablets still exist, and they exist in hundreds of thousands. This is not a collection of 300 or 400 tablets, and they reveal mostly about life in Babylon, but to some extent a lot about their science and in particular their astronomy. This is a little bit of a scramble in a way, because when I decided I would do this, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what I was going to do, and then when I started to dig into the articles, especially into the original papers, you suddenly realize that A, your knowledge is pretty deficient, and B, it's far, far more complicated than you would think. And I would venture to suggest that most undergraduate university students would have difficulty doing the math of the Babylonians did. But anyway, I'm going to do a short history of the area. Babylon is kind of a catch-all. It centered on the city-state of Babylon, but it was not Babylonian for a large part of it. We're going to talk a little bit about where the records came from, excavations, the tablets, the languages, types of records, and so on and so forth. And all of this record keeping was driven by two features. One was the need for calendrical reckoning, and more often than not by the need or the recognition that the sky reflected events on Earth, and therefore they were omens as to what would be happening in the future. And it wasn't horoscopes. Horoscopes came quite late, around 450 BC, when the Greeks came into the picture. So horoscopes are really a Greek invention, and omens are the Babylonian contribution. So in one slide, here is a collection of some of the essentially the rulers of Babylon over the ages. And we begin with Sumer, which is actually a little south of Babylon. You can see the dates on that are pretty far in. BCE is before the Christian era. So about 3400 we get writing, and the cuneiform tablets come along about 2900 BCE. And the next thing you know, we have a city-state of Akkad, with Sargon, rather famous figure historically, in those days, they didn't quite have kings, they kind of had a super president, and he conquered quite a large area. It didn't last for all that long, but and Ur came along. There were a lot of city-states, and they sort of took over one after the other with various armies, and that conquering seemed to depend more on changes in the channels that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed in. So you would have a nice little city-state sitting on the edge of a river with lots of water, great crops, and then one year there'd be a flood, and all of a sudden the river was 15 kilometers off to the west, and your city was high and dry, and lo and behold, it was now beside Ur, that they suddenly came on. But there was enough food and enough trade to get the minerals and things they didn't have, that they started the first monumental construction. Of course, the first Babylonian empire was Hammurabi, which is pretty well known for the Code of Hammurabi, the set of laws that he put in. So the Hittites came down in 1595, hung around for a couple of months or years. The chronology is a little fuzzy. Kind of sacked the place and then left. As soon as they left, the Kassites moved in. Now you have to be careful here, because these are not necessarily well-defined peoples, because the Kassites had been moving into the Babylonian or the Sumerian, Akkadian area for centuries, and it gradually merged in with the other people, and all of a sudden what happened is in the king list you suddenly find that there's a Kassite name as the king. So it wasn't so much of a battle as a gradual change in the population. But certainly Hammurabi was a major character and conquered a very large empire. The Hittites were always a problem coming down from the north, but they didn't stay very long because they were a long way out of their region, and they had the Assyrians to worry about on their flanks as they came southward. We get into Assyria itself in around 1235. They didn't conquer Babylon for a very long time. The biggest conquering was the Elamites, who were hereditary enemies of the Sumerian and Babylonian peoples. But again, they weren't there very long, and then we get the Second Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, who warrants mention in the Bible, except that it's Nebuchadnezzar the second that gets mentioned in the Bible. And the second wasn't his son, but the second Nebuchadnezzar came along about 400 years later, because everybody lived for a long time in those days according to the Bible. Various kings. There was a lot of turmoil in that era around 1000 to 700, and then we get the Assyrians, and a mixture of Chaldeans and Assyrians. Chaldeans was kind of a catch-all for just about everybody, because populations were so mixed up. And the Chaldeans are the ones who sort of make up the identity of the Magi in the Christian legends. The New Babylonian Empire was mostly Chaldeans, and then Persia came down in the 500s, and of course that ended rather abruptly at 330 with banging down Alexander the Great, and then you get the Seleucid Empire from the Greeks that lasted until 187 BC, before being supplanted by numerous other groups, but basically the Romans at the end. And so when you take a look at the major cultural groups that did all of this fighting with each other, you can see that the early Ur here and Uruk, these are the early states. The Gulf of Persia extended quite a bit farther north in those days than it does now. The coastline now is down in this area, so the sea levels have receded. And of course we have the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that come down and join together here. So each one of these cities in their turn, and getting to Babylon. And Babylon was the biggest. And it had kings at the right time to build monumental sculpture and buildings, but Sumeria was in here around these cities, and it was the Sumerians that developed the cuneiform tablets. They developed essentially what became the gods that everybody else worshipped, although under different names. They also developed the omen system, which meant that every succeeding conqueror wanted to maintain those records because every king was interested in what was going to happen to him next and what he could do about it. So the fact that they had a good astronomy connected to omens meant that Babylon became the center of that, and as each succeeding conqueror came in from different places, they kept Babylon fairly intact in order to preserve that culture of omens. So this is around 1200 BC map, and it's just a broad one of the cities. Eventually, the Assyrians controlled most of the area, and so what we have is a Babylonian Sumerian culture with the cuneiform tablets, and then in the later stages we have Akkadian, which is the language spoken from the Assyrian region. Akkadian became the language of common folks, but Sumerian and its developments in cuneiform were a sort of religious, artistic language, kind of like using Latin today, for instance, if you wanted to preserve one of the older languages as a sort of cultural thing. They even had their own maps. This one in the British Museum, clay tablet, actually fairly difficult to interpret, and there are a lot of, as with most of this stuff, there are a lot of interpretations of what this cross means and everything else. So these are probably the surrounding oceans and so on. These are city-states or something or other. There's a bit of a description here given in cuneiform, but broken up enough that there's still quite a bit of debate on just what this thing is. If you go look in these regions right now, you still find some of these cities. Some of them are still unidentified, even though they were major metropolis in the time. This is sort of what Kor looks like right now. Right now, this is a reconstruction by Saddam Hussein of one of the buildings, and a lot of this is sort of been put back together. We look at Babylon from the 1930s when this picture was taken, and parts of it now, but there's also this kind of reconstruction in the old site of Babylon right now. It's worth a look to go into Google Earth and zoom in and see what it looks like. But it was certainly a very, very large city. We all talk about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, although it appears that they weren't actually in Babylon, but farther north, I believe, in Assyria. This is what one of the repositories in a library looked like, where tablets were stored. These are somewhat larger tablets than most of the cuneiform clay bits that we get. This cuneiform accounts that we have were accumulated by many people over a long time. Some famous British excavations brought out hundreds of thousands of them when they discovered them in repositories or libraries when they were excavating in the museum. Germans also did a lot of excavating, but in the Berlin Museum and others. The French, the Iraqis, and the Iranians have a pretty good collection on their own. Chicago, Los Angeles, they're all over the world, but there's a big movement afoot now to bring them at least electronically together, because it might turn out that a piece in Los Angeles actually matches a missing piece in something in the British Museum. By far the largest part of these things are nothing more than deeds to land, legal accounts, love letters, poems, somebody or other little agreement they made with a neighbor for some reason, a bill of sale for purchase order for sheep and things like that, just counting up. The astronomical parts of it are a smaller part. So these were all put together by scribes. But in a land where writing was a fairly uncommon skill, the scribes were not always very important people who stood out in society, because there was a lot of this pretty ordinary stuff that had to be done. Initially, they tended to be linked to the temples, and the accounts they left behind were things like accounts of offerings, so many sheep, so many bushels of grain, and so on and so forth. In Assyria, which came quite a bit later, they were employed by the king himself, at least the important ones, to warn of celestial events and interpret them. You have to imagine that these would be people who had to be pretty close into the political system to be able to say to the king, well, you know, you're just going to be fine for the next 2 months, and then the next day somebody stabs them. So you have to kind of couch these omens in fairly careful phrases. But the omens are not made up on the spot. They're great big books that we'll see how the omens and how they're interpreted. And one of these is called the Enuma Annuendo, which is written in here. And the important members of that group were called the scribes of the Enuma Annuendo. And we'll get the meaning of that in a minute. In later times, it became a kind of a hereditary position where fathers would train their sons on how to write and read cuneiform. But at the same time, they had an extensive school system. So many of the tablets we find, we have complete curriculum for the school courses. We have tablets where the youngest students are practicing their first letters. We have tablets where senior ones are doing it, and teachers have crossed it all out because it's wrong. And first they're making very big crude levels because cuneiform is written with a pointed stick in wet clay, and the way you make the impression in the clay is how you construct the words. I'll show you a little bit of it. So it's quite a multi-year process, probably equivalent to elementary school through high school to learn to read this, what became a foreign language. You don't get too many pictures of them. The only one here is this one in the lower left that comes off of some of the monumental sculpture from Akkadian times. But we've had some other depictions, and I believe this is taken from Greek or Egyptian source. Sort of. Scribes were important, or could be important, if they worked for important people, doing important things. And important things tended to be religious and political. One of the descriptions on one of the tablets, the scribal art is the mother of speakers, the father of scholars. Obviously written by somebody who wasn't writing down little love notes to a girlfriend in the marketplace day by day. But there were women who were scribes because every now and then we get a tablet that says this was written by so-and-so. I'll show you the description in a minute. As the Akkadian language came along, it didn't get rid of the Sumerian script. The script itself evolved first from a pictograph to representations for words to phonetic sound. So you could very easily write Akkadian using Sumerian cuneiform script by simply replacing the original meaning with the same way we have an alphabet. And you could, each one of you could probably take your name and scratch it out in cuneiform. There's some places online that will do that for you. It may not give your name. If you actually had somebody read it, it may say it's time to do the laundry or something like that. But if you parse it out phonetically, you might say JN or something. So most of this is mundane stuff, but we did have poets and writers, and there was an awful lot of copying, so that the works from Sumerian times, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the documents that is essentially at the heart of the Old Testament and parts of Islam, came from the Epic of Gilgamesh and several other epics. And it has stories like the flood in it. As the story, in fact, seems to be true in the sense that we can't prove it isn't. One of the kings was originally the illegitimate son of one of the many princesses to the palace, and in order to hide him, she put him in a basket and dumped him in a river. And he went down the river, and some herdsmen picked him up and raised him. Well, that's a story that goes into Greek literature, and it goes into the story of Moses, and so on and so forth. So there's an awful lot of interconnection in these cultures with our own culture to this day. Not to mention the fact that they gave us the system based on 60s, like 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, and so on and so forth. So they did like their antiquarian text, so quite often you get something like the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are many, many copies of it that go down over a couple of millennia, and the stories change a little bit, and the names of the gods change a little bit. And but Gilgamesh was essentially a ruler who went off in search of immortality and couldn't find it. Killed a few bad guys along the way. Get an idea of what the counting system is. Here it is. So 1 is simply one mark made in the pointed end in and draw a slight tail on it. 2 and 3 and 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. 10 is a different symbol, and then you start combining them to make all of the others. And you get very quickly up to a counting system. But of course, we've made this into a decimal counting system in this representation, but they used a base 60 in their numbers. And when you read their accounts, and many of the authors tend to use Western numbers, but they put them in the form of the Sumerians, the Babylonians would have become very difficult to realize that 1, 20 means 1 times 60 plus, well, it wouldn't be 20, but plus 8, so you'd have 68. So it's the same as we just write a 1 or 6 and an 8, that means 6 tens and 8 ones. Well, we have to learn to think in 60s. It's tough to read that stuff. Here's a colophon. Colophon is a little phrase that usually is at the top of a tablet, if it has one at all. So this is some fellow, I don't know what this means, it's blank space, 7th tablet of this particular work, 180 lines. This was always handy for people when they find these to know if they're missing parts of the document. It is complete, checked copy from Nippur, so this is the work that's been transcribed from something out of a library in Nippur. And here is the man that did it, a young scribe and son of a royal scribe. And you must not erase. So, hey, I wrote it down, don't mess with it. And so, in spite of the fact that it says it's been checked, there actually are in a lot of these documents, in tables and numbers and things like that, there are quite often mistakes in them. And so sometimes it's not just enough to interpret it, you have to correct it along the way. And this is sort of what a drawing of the text would look like. This is probably a set of tables of some sort here. This one sort of tells you, at least the scribes that dealt with religious and political matters would say. So basically this is, you don't pass this knowledge on to just anybody. This particular one is going to reserve it for his son. You can teach it to somebody else from a different city that's even worse. So this is wherever the location of this tablet came from. So basically says you're in big trouble if you don't keep what you're doing to yourself and to your particular city, state, and your employers, either religious or political. And there were a lot of court documents, of course, that would be, in some respects, they would have been the copying machines of Europe. Calendar. They started the year with the Hawaiian rising of the Pleiades, meaning the first visibility before sunrise, or after sunset, rather. And they had a lunar calendar, so they had 12 lunations in a year. Of course, that's not enough. There's 30 days in a month, although they observed each month, so some had 29. And so they didn't come out evenly at the end of the year. So after a number of years, your calendar was out by a month, so they'd throw in an extra month called an intercalary month. Initially, it was done kind of randomly. You'd say, well, the Sirius rises on the 15th day of, I've forgotten what the first month was. And sure enough, Sirius rises on that day. But then 3 years later, Sirius isn't rising on that day anymore. It's rising on the first day of that month. 5 years later, it's rising in the month before. So we throw in an extra month to bring it back into line again. And then, so that's what it's a common system. Eventually, after a certain amount of time, they got a regular system of doing it called the Metonic system. So in a 19-year cycle, they put in 7 extra months, and this is one of the keys. First 4, 7, 9, 12, 15, 18th year, they add an extra month in. King wasn't stupid. You paid your taxes in Samanu, and they threw in an extra Samanu. You couldn't say, hey, I already paid taxes for that month, I'm skipping this month. Now they had rules. We had 2 months, because they would call the next one Samano 2. So if you had 2 of them, you still had to pay your taxes. So here's a kind of naming system, and then this one is the name of an additional whatever. Eventually they formalized it, so a month was 30 days, and there were 12 of them, which left you 5 days short at the end of the year. In terms of time, they divided the day into watches, 3 in the morning, 3 in the night, 3 in the day. But of course, the length of the day and the night changes with the seasons, even in the relatively low latitudes of Babylon and Mesopotamia. So in the summer, the watches in the daytime would be longer, and the watches at night would be shorter. And they had a scheme when they're timekeeping, when they're telling when some event happened, when the moon passed a certain star or two planets were in conjunction. If they gave the time in terms of watches, they would tell you what time of year or what kind of length of time the watch was. It became sort of understood that you went and looked at it. They divided the day into 6, called Tumberu, 1/6 of a day. And then when the turn divided into 30 units called a Pus, and that made it 4 minutes long. You can do the math, it works out. So they had a relatively small time unit. They did keep time with clepsydra, which is essentially a water clock. So you would have a hole in this that the water would run out at a certain rate and would raise a pointer in a collection bin, and that pointer would tell you the time. The problem you have with this, of course, is that as the water level runs down, the flow is slower and slower, so your time gets lost. You have to have a system of multiple buckets or somebody who keeps filling it up or something like that. When we look back at how accurately their eclipses were timed, we find that they have a sort of average area error of about 24 minutes, plus or minus 24, but sometimes went out as much as an hour and a half. To give you an idea of how accuracy they could measure events in the sky. Positions in the sky had several references as things developed. Initially, they had a series of what they called normal stars, or what we call normal stars, of the translation of by one of the scholars last century, 1800 actually. He called them normal stars, and that's what they read. So there's 2 examples right here. So you would say, well, it's so much of a distance to the southeast of the jaw of the bull, and that would give you a position. Now the second set of stars, which we used to keep time, and these were stars that passed fairly high overhead, called Zikpu stars, and so you could keep your clocks in order by what time it was when they passed directly over it. Exactly the same thing we did with our meridian telescopes up till the invention of the atomic clock. And we also used times after and before sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset as timekeepers as well. And time was often, it wasn't given in necessarily in time units, but may have been given in degrees of sky because the sky moves at a pretty regular rate. There isn't much in the way of star maps, and in fact, I'm not even sure where this one came from. But this one, there's quite a bit of argument about whether it's a star map at all. We have maps of the world, as I showed you initially, the way they saw it, but we don't have maps of the sky, or at least haven't found them yet. The Enuma Anu Enlil is one of the major works, and this is 60 to 70 tablets with up to 7,000 omens in it. And these were just ways of interpreting what happens in the sky. You would often find in a report to the king a quotation from the Enuma and then a statement that it had happened and it was good or bad for the king. These are pretty old, this document. I mean, we have versions that were put together recently, say 600 BC or 500 BC, but the knowledge in it comes from up in the 2000 BC here, probably accumulated quite a bit. So here's tablet 63, which is called the Venus tablet. And the reason for that is because it's got a number of records of observation of Venus with the associated omens. Now, again, the Enuma has been copied many times with many different versions of it in Akkadian civilization, Babylonian, Sumerian, and so on and so forth. And mostly the same. You can see that King Amenhotep, after Hammurabi, seemed to have collected everything from smaller tablets and put them all together in one place. Anyway, what we have here is the times of Venus and the saliva settings, and for a fairly short period. And you can see that there are various dates given for this, but one of the most reliable pieces of scholarly research suggested 1550 BC was the date of those observations. So here's the first lines that come out of this tablet here, and really what it is just telling you where Venus was in each month. So year 1 sets in this month, day 15, rises again, same month on day 18. So this is a very short time period when Venus is in inferior conjunction. Because you see it sets on one and rises on the other, and in inferior conjunction you can get all the way down to 0 where you want Venus set one day and rise the next morning. Although that only happens under certain circumstances. So this is basically where Venus was over a 5-year period and the dates and times in each one of them. So if you need to refer back to where Venus was at some time in the past, which we did, there it is, all laid out for you in the tablets. And the way it works here, of course, is that when you're on the Earth here and Venus is over on this side, you see it in the evening part of the sky until it gets too close to the sun. And the 3 days mentioned is when it crossed the sun and then became in the morning sky over here. And so it remained for quite a long time in those two because the Earth is moving this way, Venus is moving this way, and they're sort of going along together, although Venus is a little bit quicker. And that's exactly the situation we're in right now with Venus. Venus has passed this point and is now in about this point in the way you see it. It's getting brighter because it's getting closer to us, but it's also going to start to fade away after the 17th because it becomes more and more of a thin crescent, and then it'll be in conjunction sometime toward the end of this month, maybe next month, when it passes across the sun or above or below the sun, and then becomes a morning object. When Venus is on this side, it's not visible for quite an extended period of time. So that's basically what the tablet was reporting, was the dates and times at which Venus made these transitions from one side to the next. So that the document, when you see these names like the Enuma Enlil, these names come from the first lines of the document itself. That was the way they named them. So what the first lines mean is when the gods Anu and Enlil. So here's some of the omens. If in Nisanu, that's a month, the sunrise looks sprinkled with blood and the light is cool, rebellion will not stop in the country. There will be devouring by a dad. And that would be one of the city-states nearby that was often at odds with where this particular text came from. It's pretty grim stuff. So you got to hope that not very often the sunrise looked like it was sprinkled with blood. It may never look like it's sprinkled with blood because some of the things that are written about in these are impossible. You know, when the sun is in the dipper, well, it never gets into the dipper. So, but if it ever did, you're in trouble. The text that we just talked about was omens. Enuma and Enlil had observations, but it was provide omens. But they also had this thing called diaries, where the translation means regular watching. And these were fairly rare to come by in the 750 BC era, but by the time you get back into 500, they're pretty regular day by day. And so what they are is just the recording of events that were seen each night and during the day by the scribes and the priests that were watching. So you had things like times of moonrise and moonset, time between them, planetary that were up, when they went past stars, visibility of Sirius, they get the weather, you get the current market prices for a number of items, and anything of local, regional interest. So you get text like this. I'm not going to read this out. I know it's a little tough, but, you know, last part of the night, the moon was 4 cubits below Eta Tauri, the moon having passed a little to the east. But on the 20th, north wind blew, night of the 21st, the north wind blew last part of the night, the moon was a half cubit above Alpha Tauri, moon having passed a half a cubit to the east. These 7, 8, 9 are lines in the text. So this is basically a record. At the end, we see the equivalent was barley in the beginning of month, 2 pan 3 soup in the middle of the month, 2 pan 4 soup, 2 pois at the end of the month, 2 pan 4 soup dates, 2 pan 4 soup mustard tree curve. So they had their equivalent of the stock market report in the same thing. And if there was an eclipse, that would be recorded. Sometimes more serious events that were reported. This is an account in the diaries of Alexander's conquest of Darius and when the Persian Empire. But it starts out what a shekel of silver equivalent was, 1 kur, or the word lacuna means missing text. So some kur. So it tells you what the value of silver was, mustard, and so on, and so where Scorpio and Venus and everybody else was. And you sort of get down there. In the 7th in Sippar, an order of Alexander to the Babylonians was sent as follows: into your houses they shall not enter. On the 13th, the vanguard advanced to the Sikala gate, to the outer edge of Esikila, and the Babylonians prostrated themselves. On the 14th, those Ionians, a bull short, something missing there, fatty, too short. Alexander, king of the world, came into Babylon, horses and equipment of, and the Babylonians and the people, a message, and so on and so forth. So there were sometimes really earth-shattering events that took second place to the price of silver and barley and mustard. But this is essentially as close as we get to first-person accounts there, because Greek history tends to be full of a lot of funny stories along the way. Other than the diaries, we have this thing called goal year texts. So if I was writing a goal year text for next year, I would be writing a text just like the observer's handbook that tells you where everything's going to be over the next year. Well, how do you do that? They did have a mathematical scheme, but what they did is they said, how many years do I have to go back to find the same situation? And then I'll just take those positions. Well, of course, that's going to depend on the sidereal period of the various planets, but it has to be an even number. So Saturn has 29.5 year sidereal period, but that's a half a year out. So if it was on the 1st of June, that means Saturn would be in the same place on the 1st of January. You don't want to know that. You want to know where it's going to be on the 1st of June. So you have to take two sidereal periods, which comes out to a nice round 59 years, although not quite, because it's a little short of that, and say, well, go back 59 years, Saturn will be next year in the same place as it was 58 years from now, or 59 years from next year. And this is based on observations such as this that come from the diaries, and this is telling you where Jupiter is. So, first appearance in front of the Chariot, which is one of the constellations. You see a lot of stuff missing here. Move back to the east, so it went into retrograde motion there. Year 19. So you have year 7, year 19, year 31, and these are the positions of Jupiter where they were at each one of those months at 12-year intervals. And you can see that it changes. In front of the Chariot means that it was ahead of the constellation. The Chariot, by year 19, is behind the constellation of the Chariot, and on the 25th, in a different position. So you're beginning to see that it's not quite following a regular pattern, but of course if you go until you get a nice even set of numbers, then everything will come out to the point where you can use past information to do your whole year text. And here's some of the corrections that they've done over the years. It wasn't constant, it depended on who was doing it. So if you wanted a goal year, you went back 71 years, well, 83 years for Jupiter. You get Mercury 46, Saturn 59 years. But notice it got a little more accurate, 59 years minus 6 days. But it wasn't, everybody didn't agree. 30 years plus 9 days, 30 years plus 7 degrees, 20 minutes. So that's where they've taken a time unit as a degrees inside, or 147 years. So then these are different texts. Late Babylonian astronomical text here, 59 years minus 5 days, and so on and so forth. So they were fishing around a little bit to find out exactly what it was like. But here we have Saturn in December 10, 1941, Saturn here underneath the Pleiades. Here it is December 10, 2000. Again, it's actually slightly behind, should be about here to match exactly, but it's pretty close. They use a 59-year goal year text. So they would publish these goal year texts for a couple of years as far as they wanted into the future, and then they would have time to maybe to find out what the omens, the significance of these things are. And this pattern of finding times in the past that will work in the future also extended later on to eclipses. Here's one where we have Venus, and then after 8 years, it's here. It's actually in 2017, this is tonight actually, it's just about parallel with this star. You see it's slightly above it here. Very close separation of 8 years, which is why we had an 8-year separation between the two transits of Venus back a few years. The zodiac didn't really come into its current form until about the 5th century, when they formally divided it into 12 30-degree segments. Until then, it was sort of roughly divided like that. And in fact, in the early times, the zodiac stars followed the orbit of the moon, not the orbit of the sun. It took them a while to get that figured out, in part because you have to have a good enough astronomy that when you see the sun over there, you know what stars are behind it. So you have to be able to calculate the position of the sun and put it in the stars to know that the sun is passing underneath a certain star on a certain date. So about 700 BC, the constellations from a document called Mulatan were changed to 12 irregular groups, and then later on they were changed to fixed 30-degree constellations. And that's essentially where our current zodiac comes from, although not all with the same names. The one thing they didn't do is that the zodiac was set on the fixed stars, not on the vernal equinox like we do. So you had some changes as a result of perception. Will happen is only 2, maybe 3 tablets. It looks like it originated quite a long time in the past, down around 1370 is the latest. And it just says the names of the stars with their rising and setting and culmination that passing overhead dates. This means the plow, and it actually refers to an area that's near triangular, close to the Andromeda Galaxy. So, I'm not going to, other than show you what this is, here are the 18 stations of the moon, the constellations along the path of the moon before the zodiac and before they started to put along the path of the sun. So we have the star cluster called the Bristle, which is the Pleiades, the Bull of Heaven, which is Taurus and the Hyades, the Loyal Shepherd of Heaven, which is Orion. Interesting. The old one, Perseus, so on. These are the Scimitar, the Great Twins, again Gemini. So you can see that the crayfish is now Cancer. And then there were things that got outside of the normal zodiac as we know it. So you've got parts of Pegasus and Pisces here, Pisces and Andromeda here, and so on and so forth. So it was the beginnings of the struggle to put together not so much a zodiac as a map of the path of the sun. So it lists the constellations and their associated gods, and they divided the sky into 3 paths, north, central, and southern, and they had constellations in each one of them. These essentially circumpolar, these would be equatorial, these would be southern stars. And again, we have this ideal calendar. And lots of different things that were calculated for these in this document. There's a sort of tablet 2 on it. So we had names for the sun and planets. Notice that they travel the same path as the moon. They don't exactly, but it was a recognition that the stars and the planets stick to a certain band in the sky. They indicated what stars would have the full moon at the solstices, but of course this is a year-to-year event. When the planets are visible, again, these are not fixed dates. They change all the time, but we get mathematical schemes for giving some of these details. Dates is when the sun is in each stellar path, that is the 3 north, south, and north, central, and southern path, and all pretty much in the central line. And a few omens in there. So it's kind of an interesting document being so small, but some of the things here on the 1st of Nisan, the hired man becomes visible. Well, this is just standard constellation stuff that in January, what constellation? Hercules rises. We'd like to say in the morning, but he's just saying that, okay, it's coming up on that day. And so you get this sort of list of things when they appear. And it tells you the length of the day watch and the night watch. The daytime watch is twice as long as the nighttime watch because of the changes in the length of the day versus the night. So it's an interesting calendrical time system that allows you to keep track of the seasons of the year by whatever's rising, and of course, when this doesn't work, then you have to throw in that intercalary. Other kinds of text we had were letters. Letters were responses to a question. So here's one to the king, my lord. There's a lot of this, your servant, and here's the name of the scribe, the hill, etc. The king wrote to me, is it favorable for the crown prince to come into the presence of the king? And then he goes on to say why it's very favorable that they have been. And then he mentions planet Mercury, which represents the crown prince, is visible in the constellation Aries. Venus is visible in Babylon, in the house of his dynasty, and the moon. So these are all significant locations to the king at the time. And so because Mercury is in these, it's considered a good omen for the crown prince to visit the king. Presumably he's not going to assassinate him and take away the kingdom. Reports, on the other hand, were unsolicited comments that were sent to the king or other officials. These always are based on observation, but they start with essentially a quotation from some book of omens, which says that on the 14th the sun and moon are seen together, gods remember Akkad favorably. These are all citing the omens. The king of Elam will widely. Okay, and then we get here, the moon came into opposite with the sun on the appropriate day, and its position is equal to the sun, pretending a reign of long days, well-being to the king of the world and his people. Comrade said the elder servant of the king. So he says, here's the omen that says if this happens, here's what the consequences are, and then he says it's happening. You probably go and search it out, whatever it means for that. We have another set of documents, the astronomical cuneiform tablets. Again, these are how they calculated stuff. So you get procedure text of the rules for computing, you get functions such as the velocity of the sun and moon, and then you have the ACT, which are these, and these are the non-mathematical astronomical texts, which are the global year texts and other things. So these are, I'd like to think of these as, NMAT is what the astrologers use, and ACT is what the astronomers use. But of course, it's too simple because quite often with the same people that produce these. Eclipses. They went with the same thing with eclipses as they did with everything else. They looked for a pattern in the past, and they realized quite early on they're probably using lunar eclipses because they're more widely visible than solar eclipses. But they realized fairly quickly that they repeated at intervals of 5 or 6 months, or at least they could. And if you look at the pattern of repeat with eclipses, that's the way it works. So here's a document I drew up. You see that eclipses repeat after 1 month, as well as 5 or 6 months. But the 1 month tends to be penumbral eclipses and probably not very visible for very small eclipses. And the Babylonians were not really aware of that. So they knew that 5 or 6 months out you would get another solar eclipse somewhere, not necessarily in Babylon, although with a lunar eclipse there's a good chance you'd see it. We find tables, long tables of eclipses going back to 730 BC, but a lot of the eclipses in it were predicted eclipses, not observed eclipses. And they certainly got to know the eclipse cycle. And here's an early prediction. Concerning the watch of the sun about which the king my lord wrote to me, it is indeed the month for a watch of the sun. Keeps watch twice, on this 5th month and the 6th month. In other words, they weren't sure. It was time for an eclipse, but they didn't know which month it was going to be in. And then here's another one. If the moon is eclipsed at an unappointed time, that means you're expecting it on the 6th month, and it came in on the 5th month. It means that either 6 months have not yet passed, or alternatively, the eclipse was a little early. If you plot a graph of eclipses in our physical system, where here's from 2000 to 2200, and the dates, they form a pretty regular pattern, and you can make predictions of these by collecting up places that join together in one across here. Each one of them is a cycle. With the Babylonians, they get on this cycle, which joins. So if you had the eclipse here, you know there would be another one here. If you had one here, you know it would be there. And one here, you know there would be one there. And this is called the Saros cycle of 18.03 years. So given enough observations in the past, you can predict all of these eclipses in here by simply looking back 18 and a bit years. And of course, then your question was, is the eclipse visible in Babylon? And that became a little bit of a different question. But in the end, they were able to get accurate enough to be able to say that it's going to occur in the middle of the night, the early part of the night, early part of the night. I looked up one the other day, and sure enough, there was an eclipse, but it was only visible in Antarctica. But they knew that there had to be an eclipse somewhere, because they were familiar with the moon rising in eclipse, the sun rising in eclipse, or setting in eclipse, or reports from other regions where the eclipse was visible, but not in the more northerly region. Here's a particular observation. This is a lunar eclipse. It's got quite a bit of detail. This is a time unit, 52 degrees. Each degree is 4 minutes, so that's 208 minutes after sunset. Alpha Cygni had culminated in a lunar eclipse. Began on the east side, that's the east side of the moon, in 17 degrees, that's the time, covered completely. Onset was slow, fast, maximum phase, the third eclipse blew red, so it was a total eclipse, the north wind blew all the planets turned out, 5 cubits behind the Capricorn. These were all important for the omens, in particular the wind direction and speed was important for the omens. Here's what it looked like when you go back and look at it. It says 225, not 226, because of course there's another zero in our calendrical system. So Babylon, right in here, well within the zone of total eclipse, but it wasn't quite across the middle, which is the reason why it talks about what part of the first appeared. Things can get kind of serious with these. This is what you have to observe when you have an eclipse. And then you go into innuendo or the interpretation. And so you get into this. The moon is eclipsed in Leo and finishes the watch, and the north wind blows. Jupiter does not stand. It means it's not visible in the eclipse. Saturn and Mars are in Aries or in Sagittarius. There's a field, which is another constellation. And then there's a little bit of a and as you in the eclipse, a halo surrounds the moon, and Regulus is inside the halo. And then Kim's in big trouble. So it's probably a set of circumstances. You have to have an eclipse near Regulus. You have to have a circle around the moon, which means it has to be a little bit thin cirrus, something like that. And you have to have Jupiter in the right place and the other planets in the right place. Well, you're not going to go to the king and say, hey boy, your time is up. So, instead you kind of reserve that. If you ever saw that, you'd probably wonder, boy, do I go and tell this guy that? If it doesn't happen, I'm in big trouble. Maybe I should just sort of hint. So we've done 2,500 years in a little over 45 minutes. Pretty superficial, I will tell you. You've got time. If you're under 10, you might want to tackle that. And I really marvel at the people who can read these things and interpret them. In particular, a fellow named John Steele, who seems to be the modern guru of eclipses, although some of the older guys are still alive. Helps to have a lot of mathematical skills and some decent mud for the figure of tablets. And anyway, I hesitate to ask for questions, but the clock was the placenta, but remember, every one of those measurements of so many cubits to the southeast of such and such a star, which would be one of their normal stars typically, you immediately have a time unit there because you can calculate when that star is culminating, for instance, and so you have a position. But for sort of casual stuff, they would use the placenta. And there's a lot of documentation that they could be accurate with it, but it's just quite a bit of rigor. And being an astronomer in those years, you probably rely on timing based on sunrise, sunset, which you can calculate very accurately, or the passage, the culmination of one of your normal stars. But they also had the Zipku stars that they used for actual timekeeping. So you could sort of take your water clock and say, well, it took 12 minutes until such and such a star culminated, and the eclipse began 4 minutes before that, so 16 minutes before the culmination of that star. So here's the time that occurred. But when you look back at this time, you sort of see a standard deviation of 24 minutes, but they can go up to a couple hours off, depending on how much rigor they put into the observation.
Okay, the Chinese were known for their long-term record keeping. How did that compare with this as well?
Well, Don Steele's done a lot of work on that as well. The Chinese records are difficult to interpret because they didn't include a lot of time information. They would say there was an eclipse, they wouldn't even necessarily tell you what day it was, but it was in the spring there was an eclipse. So the Babylonians were distinct in that they gave you quite a bit of timing information. The Chinese eventually did, but the timing was sort of less accurate until the Jesuits got to China. Well, maybe not quite that way, but certainly it was into the after the Christian era, these times. So. But there's a lot of, just knowing there was an eclipse that goes far back far enough helps you, because there's this change in the rotation rate of the Earth that has to be figured into these things. That's still a subject for a lot of work, because it isn't a nice regular curve. It goes up and down quite a bit, and trying to tease out the exact times. You know, you get these eclipse records, but if the top's broken, you may not know what city it was observed in, but that it happened. So you have to, that adds uncertainty into your placement of their time. You can go online and type in a Babylonian date, and it'll give you the current date in our own calendar.
So what caused the end of all this? Lovely. What caused the end of all of this lovely documentation of this? Greeks.
Not right away. The Seleucid Empire, after Alexander, of course, his generals took over the area, and they ruled it for 300 years, but they immediately moved the capital out of Babylon and moved everybody out of Babylon, and it fell apart. But they the actual scribal records go to about AD 150, and then they fade. So there was still a couple of guys, maybe some girls doing it up to fairly late era. But the Greeks came along, they had different ideas about the sky, they had measuring instruments. Those are really the best ones of those came from Islam. So yeah, it was the Greeks that took it all apart. Of course, they then built it into horoscopes. And horoscopes really a Greek idea.
Did you record the wind direction? Did you think that they had some of the
Winds were important. In some of these omens, you also want to look at where the lesions are on a sheep's liver as well. But the weather was, boy, if you had a thunderstorm with an eclipse, you were in big trouble. Somebody was in big trouble. So, you know, hey, look at this neat lightning picture I got with the lunar eclipse. Hey, boy. North America's coming back. Make that happen. Okay, pizza time? Okay. Thank you all very much.